Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Flight podcast. I'm once again joined by Florian and Keith Preston. We're here today to pick up on we left off on themes from last roundtable about the nature of the fear of Caleb Maupin's concept of libidinal release and whether it's going to be a violent one or a creative one, because it could also in turn be a creative one. That would be the positive expression. And how likely is that in the United States? And that feeds into the idea, well, we have a Mad Max scenario. So let's begin by sort of discussing the nature or the character of the U.S. If we look at the founding of the 13 colonies, so we start with Jamestown, 1609, and then Plymouth in 1620. We see that, and then from there all the way up to the 13 colonies declaring independence in 1776. We see that there's a key difference between the New World experiment and the Old World, right? So in the Old World, you had unaccountable political institutions with the ancien regimes, like in France and Prussia and Austria and Russia. England was sort of accountable. It had parliament, but parliament didn't always respond to the demands of the people. So it was kind of like in this transition phase. Now, the founding settlers were, and we know this because they explicitly stated they were inspired by this. Thomas Jefferson, for example, at one point floated the idea that the reverse seal of the United States should be Hengist and Horsa, the two Saxon brothers that came over under the British tyrant Vortigern in order to establish the Saxon kingdoms of England, saying that American law is a derivative of the Saxon Germanic law, which was, I would argue, a tribal democracy organized around what we now call the Volksmut or the Moot, the gathering of the men together to make a decision. So England had that up until 1066. That's called the idea of the Norman yoke. And then the founding fathers and the English settlers before them were like, well, we want to go back to what we had before the Normans. And the king and the Anglican Church and eventually later financial institutions that developed in the 18th and 19th century were sort of cast in that light. And so in the United States, one of the main things is the use of force and violence against lawbreakers in this country. So we have in the 8th Amendment of the Constitution, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. So in Europe, in the 18th century, it was quite common to have people drawn and quartered. You could put people to the rack. You could mutilate people. So one way to ensure that somebody would not be eligible for the line of succession would be to blind them or to castrate them. And we have examples in Byzantine history and even British monarchical history of just these things happening in order to prevent somebody from being in the line of succession. And in the United States, we the settlers and then the Constitution were like, no, we just don't support this kind of behavior. It's cruel and unusual. Now, even if you go to the pre-Constitution period, the 13 colonies, the hardliners, so the Puritans would be probably the most hardline, who want to impose some sort of Mosaic civil code on New England. The total amount of capital offenses are actually quite low compared to what we had in Old England. And this complaint about the brutality of English laws also in the preamble to Thomas More's Utopia. He's like, this is just crazy. This is supposed to be a Christian nation, and people have their hands cut off and killed for petty thefts. I mean, that's insane, and that's not going to happen in the United States. And even when we have, say, the Salem witch trials, one of the most famous ones was, I can't remember her name now, but there was some woman who was claimed to be a prophetess, and she was just expelled. She wasn't even burned to the stake. I mean, a lot of feminists would pick up on this, but I mean, compared to old Europe, she'd have just been lit up and burned, and it's over. So, even here we see that the Americans are trying to do something different. Even, of course, the Quakers in Pennsylvania could probably be seen as the most lenient and tolerant of the groups, but even the stereotypically least tolerant, we're not going to resort to the drawing and quartering or auto da fes like in Spain, which were still going on. I mean, Voltaire satirizes auto da fes in Candide, and that's written around the time of the assertion of the 13 colonies as an independent country. So, Americans have decided that that's not how we're going to solve conflict. In the American Civil War, afterwards, even though during the war, say, Sherman and Sheridan can be quite heavy-handed, destroying property and such, We don't have mass reprisals or murders of the defeated side like we would see in Russia or France or Mexico or almost any other country at the time. So violence in the American context, even though throughout our history we haven't lived up to these highest standards, has always been to reduce the scope of violence. Now, with the forever wars and industrial warfare, you might say, wasn't there a contradiction here? Yeah, there is sort of, because the United States would just, unload all the B-52s on Vietnam or something, and that's, horrible. But eventually, the Vietnam War ended. Eventually, conscription ended, and I think it was because the American spirit overall was like, why are we doing this? This is completely antithetical to who we are as Americans. So this little brief history lesson, in short, is to show that I believe the American project was, in one sense, though not by all means in all senses, to sort of re-envision society in which this kind of brutal application of violence isn't really acceptable across the board. And so how does this feed into, we have Mad Max again? Well, I think what this means is when this suppressed energy is released, we're going to see a lot more creative expression than we will see violent. So I've talked about this in some of our analysis about geopolitics. In the Rimland, which is Eastern Europe, the Middle East, South Asia, Indochina, and the Pacific Rim, we probably will see a lot of violence as a result of this release of energy. Partly because we have old ethnic conflicts that haven't been resolved, partly because these civilizations just don't have the same values as Americans. And then from the American point of view, North America, even before the European settlement, was sparsely populated. At most, not counting Mexico, of course, you might have had at most maybe 5 million Native Americans in the lower 48, Alaska, and Canada. At most, probably closer to 1 million. So we don't have these old population centers that have long-seated historic grievances. Most of the grievances we have had in recent years are stimulated by the synthetic left. And the recent Trump electoral victory could be construed as Americans just getting tired of that. We're just tired of these contrived, stimulated conflicts, which, if that is the case, is a good sign for the future. Because as society degrades, people will be less interested in going to an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth mentality. So I think we have some grounds for optimism when it comes to how will the declining American empire or collapse affect the American people? And will this release be a violent, destructive overall, or will it be more creative overall? Florian.
Yeah, many things. Many things to unpack. So, well, yeah, I agree with Todd so far with the history of colonies. Um, there was a stark difference between the old and new world in terms of punishments and laws. There's also quite a big pettiness about the punishments in the old world. Like one example that's it's not just the drawing and quartering, which can be seen as which is actually cruel and excessive because you get disemboweled while you're still alive. Um, they had this one case of many, I'm sure, but there was a guy named Titus Oates in 1685, and that was still under King Charles II's reign, and he was convicted of perjury after some popish plot. It was a false conspiracy, and he claimed that Catholics planned to assassinate King Charles. It was all wrong, so he was punished, and he was sentenced to be whipped through the streets of London 5 days a year for the rest of his life. So, and otherwise he would place in a pillory, imprisoned. So basically, the poor guy would be dragged out 5 days a year for the rest of his life and whipped through the streets of London. This is almost nonsensical, and it's a key example, right? What cruel and unusual meant, and what they wanted to prevent in the colony. Also, and I found interesting that you mentioned that American law is a derivative of Saxon law. It's more community oriented, right? You cannot have excessive or unusual punishment. You cannot be excessively cruel in a small community because you may you will rely on the relatives and friends of the guys that you punish, and they need to vote for you, or they need to work together with you. In a small community, you cannot be excessively violent, or you will immediately lose the support of the community. And that's also what they saw, the pioneers and settlers. I think they saw some examples how smaller villages in Europe were just destroyed by excessive punishments and excessive cruelty, and that can't be. So interesting also that the Puritans were part of the settlers. Not all of them were Puritans, but the Puritans, I think they replaced the unusual and cruel edge of the punishments with public shaming, right? So somebody was engaged in adultery or using lewd words or whatever, they would put into the stocks, I think that's what you call it. They would basically made to stand in the public square and be shamed, or they could be wearing a scarlet letter, which meant actually having like a big letter like A for adultery on your clothes that you had to wear for the rest of your life, so everyone would know that you are an adulteress or adulterer. And but that was it, right? That was public shaming. You could still go on with your life. It may have been more difficult after you get publicly shamed, but the philosophy was also that this had a deterrent effect on people, right? You don't want to run around with a scarlet letter, or you don't want to be put in public square and everyone laughs at you and stuff like that. You don't want that to happen. So that was, but still you were kept alive and you weren't tortured or anything like that. So I think that's what the Puritans kind of replaced the cruel edge of their punishment with, and also the Puritans, they were Bible oriented, and they also stressed out mercy towards your foes and treat your lawbreakers just but fair and all that, right? And also interesting about the Salem witch trials, they weren't even burning witches, or those that they thought were witches. Afterwards, they reconsidered because most Puritans were shocked by what happened there in Salem. And so one thing they did, and that also plays in, they didn't allow spectral evidence anymore. So the witch trials sometimes relied on spectral evidence, where they would basically accuse your spirit or your specter, your ghost, of doing these things. And then you were fucked, because you could have an alibi. Somebody got killed or like had a bad harvest, you got an alibi, but your ghost, your spirit did not, right? So your spirit could have committed all these trespasses, and you had an alibi. It doesn't matter, your ghost was still out, and so you would still kill no matter what, right? So spectral evidence was not allowed anymore afterwards, and that's also a difference to Europe, I think. And one thing that I realized when you were talking about civil war, some of the generals were cruel and they went on a rampage, like Sherman's march to the sea and stuff like that. But afterwards, it was about reconciling everyone. So basically, the North sent the Southern soldiers back. They could keep their horse, and they just sent them back home. They didn't execute them or imprison them or something like that. And I think more and more towards the modern time, you cannot dominate people with cruelty. I remember that Stefan Molyneux had a video about the Matrix, and he basically talked about human farms. So you want people to be productive for you if you're part of the ruling class, but you cannot institute cruel punishments. You need to have people go along. So in that case, cruel and unusual punishment has probably also outlived its use, right? So so that's what comes to mind as a reply to what Todd said. Let me see. Yeah,
While you're looking that up,
Yep.
Florian, 2 points I want to make. The woman I mentioned was Anne Hutchinson, and then there was also Roger Williams, both of which were roughly contemporary and condemned for theological errors, but they were both banished. Hutchinsons were later killed by Narragansett Indians in a raid, and then what was I going to say? Then the other guy, Roger Williams, founded Rhode Island. So, in fact, the two big examples of theological nonconformity in New England that everybody, complains about, compared to what would happen in England, even, or France or Spain, this was nothing. I mean, this was absolutely nothing. Go ahead, it's fine.
Just as a quick remark, we also have to realize what happened in the colonies. That the British Crown, they could just come in, swoop in. They put soldiers in your house, or you can just raid your home. They can drag you out and try you in Britain, and then you're away from the colony at all, right? And settlers saw that, and they wanted to avoid punishments like that. So that was also one reason. And lastly, you mentioned that the settlers were Puritans, but they were also Quakers, for example, in Pennsylvania. These Quakers didn't they were they would abhor violence, right? So didn't want to have capital punishment to begin with. And sooner or later, you had, and they were Anglicans in Virginia. Sooner or later, you have to work together with these people, and you have to accept their point of view at least somewhat, and that also contributed to the Eighth Amendment and correlated action.
All right, Keith.
Well, as far as the use of extreme punishments in American history, there are plenty of examples of that. For example, in the colonial period, you could brand a criminal with a hot iron. They would brand a letter on you depending on what you did. Like you get a T for a thief, or you get an M for manslaughter, or you get an SL if you were a slave that was being disobedient. You know, they had things like tar and feathering. That was a form of public torture where they pour hot tar on you and stick feathers in. That would lead to burns and infections and that kind of stuff. The practice of lynching is well known. You know, also in some of the colonies, they did have punishments for amputation, like cutting off ears and fingers and hands and that kind of stuff. Into the 19th century, when slavery still existed, you had slave punishments like the Iron Mask and this thing called a cat o' nine tails, or the neck collars and spikes and that kind of stuff. You know, even later than that, there were things like the sweat box or hot boxes that were used in prisons as a form of torture. Of course, there was also electric shock treatment and lobotomies and psychiatric punishments that were used on mental patients well into the 20th century. So there have been things, you know, somewhat similar to that in U.S. history, but it is true that over time, the United States has done away with these kinds of extreme punishments. And even early on, like the amendment, the Eighth Amendment prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment, the goal was what Todd said. It was to get past the kinds of things that had happened in traditional European societies, where they had burnings at the stake and public beheadings and drawing and quartering and all kinds of things like breaking over the wheel, you know, all of these kinds of things that many different types of societies going back to antiquity had used. I mean, the Romans, for instance, were famous for crucifixions and feeding people to wild animals and all that kind of stuff. And you saw comparisons to that in other cultures. The Chinese used to use a form of execution called slicing, and what they would do is they take this thing, it looks like a paring knife, and they just slice skin off of you until you died. They're like literally peeling a human. So, you know, this, and historically, this kind of stuff was the norm, not the exception. So it is true that I think in the post-Enlightenment era, you started to get, you know, both Enlightenment thinkers like the philosophes who oppose some of this kind of stuff, and also religious reformers like Florian mentioned, the Quakers. You started to see both these lines of thought converging towards the idea of trying to do away with some of these more extreme forms of punishment. In fact, that's how the concept of the penitentiary developed. Like the penitentiary idea was developed by religious reformers, and their idea was, well, instead of like hanging somebody or torturing them to death, we're just going to send them off somewhere where they should learn to be penitent. You know, they're going to put them in prison, basically, you know, and we'll let them, you know, read the Bible or whatever, and they'll learn how to be penitent. For, of course, you know, like I know I saw a lecture by G. Gordon Liddy many years ago. He was one of the Watergate defendants, and he had served time in prison for Watergate-related offenses. And he said, I don't know why they call it the penitentiary. Nobody there was penitent, certainly not I. So, you know, and that's more, I think, a more realistic view of the idea of the penitentiary. But that's where the concept of the penitentiary comes from, you know, in American language and all of that. And, you know, nowadays we're increasingly moving away from that kind of stuff. I think about half of the American states have abolished capital punishment altogether. And in Europe, I think all the EU member states and probably most European countries now have abolished the death penalty. I think Belarus still has it. Even Russia has put the moratorium on the use of the death penalty for common crimes. They still have it for state offenses like that kind of thing. So worldwide, I think over 100 nations have either abolished the death penalty or discontinued its use informally. So there is a worldwide trend towards the use of the death penalty. I mean, the abolish of the death penalty and the abolition of torture and this kind of stuff. I hear a lot of people say the world is moving in a more authoritarian direction, like we're moving more towards fascism, and it's kind of like, I understand the arguments for that, but on the other hand, I'll look at it like I'll believe it when all of these moratoriums on the death penalty are rescinded, because that's historically one of the hallmarks of state power is the ability to execute people that you don't like or torture them to death. And I actually philosophically oppose capital punishment for that reason, because if you look at its history, that's what it was for. It's about the state being able to keep people in line through terror. It wasn't just about avenging terrible crimes and things like that. So for that reason, I tend to oppose the death penalty.
So then real quick, Keith, would that mean you'd be in favor of dueling? So in that sense, dueling could still bring death as a consequence to certain behaviors, but it wouldn't be done by the state.
It's something I'd be indifferent to. Like, let's say in the United States, we made dueling legal and two idiots want to go out and duel over a slight or something, fine. But I wouldn't really care one way or the other. And I do think that there has been a curve on this kind of extreme violence in many parts of the world in modern times, not just in the United States. But it is true the United States was one of the first countries that had the concept like the Bill of Rights and trying to rein in some of these kinds of excesses of state power that existed in the Middle Ages and in the ancient world. Now, parallel to that, we've seen the rise of modern totalitarian regimes that actually practice genocide and ethnic cleansing and all of this kind of stuff. So, you could say, well, one step forward, two steps backward, maybe. But I do think there has been a general worldwide trend towards reforming some of this kind of stuff, as evidenced by the increasingly global moratorium on the death penalty. And as far as the future of violence in America, I hear a lot of people these days say, well, crime is on the rise. And I don't know statistically, I think there was a surge in crime following the pandemic or during or following the pandemic. But at the same time, crime in the United States is much lower than it was, say, 30 years ago. We had a surplus of crime, I guess, in the 70s and 80s on into the early 90s. And that seems to have reduced for whatever reason. I don't necessarily think it's stricter or more effective law enforcement, because the clearance rate on serious crimes, like even murder, murder is generally considered the most serious crime. The clearance rate on murder in the United States is slightly over 50%. That means half of all people who commit murder get away with it. So it's not necessarily that law enforcement is more effective. It may be less effective, but I think that things that have contributed to the reduction in crime have probably been things that aren't immediately obvious. One is the increased pervasiveness of surveillance cameras. Surveillance cameras are everywhere. Every business has them. Every apartment complex has them. Every street has them. So it's harder to get away with crime if you're going to be on camera. And people know that. People know they're going to be on crime. That's one thing. There are some people who argue that the increased abortion rates that happened in the 70s and 80s had the effect of aborting a whole generation of criminals out of existence. I don't know how you'd actually prove that, but it's an interesting theory.
Well, real quick, I think the argument they would make is that based on socioeconomic participation in abortion rates, people of the lower end of that spectrum, who liberals tend to view more prone to crime, are selected out. Now, I mean, Do I believe that? No, but I think that's their argument.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's plausible. I mean, it's plausible that, like somebody that, a pregnancy that occurred in the 70s would have been of prime crime age by the 90s. And if that pregnancy was aborted, then you would have, you could say, well, future criminals were aborted along the way. So maybe, who knows? There's a lot of other things that some criminologists use to explain why crime rates have fallen. But I know something about criminology, and there's really not that many things that are clear predictors as to how much crime there's going to be in society. Probably the most consistent one is high unemployment rates. That tends to be the strongest corollary with crime. But there's other things, and none of them seem to be precise determinants. In the future, though, I do think there could be an increase of violent crime, or I mean, maybe not violent crime, but violence in the United States. And not necessarily in terms of violent crime, but in terms of political violence. Like I've thought before, and I think I've mentioned on some of these programs that in the future we could be moving towards a situation like the Troubles in Northern Ireland in the 70s and 80s, or like I know when we had Caleb Maupin on, we were talking about the years of lead in Italy in the post-war period. I could see political violence of that type becoming more commonplace, because whenever you have extreme political polarization, depending on how extreme it gets, there is an increase in violence, particularly when economic conditions are poor. Like we keep seeing this rising class polarization. We see rising living costs. I was just watching a video earlier today where Ben Norton, the journalist, was talking about the bubble that's in the economy now. And a lot of economists are predicting there's going to be a major economic crash coming again sometime in the years ahead. Similar to the Great Recession of 08 or maybe even the Great Depression of 1929. So, political polarization combined with economic collapse generates violence typically. I mean, most famously in Weimar in Germany in the 20s, that's what happened. Our society may not go in quite that extreme a direction, but I could certainly see that happening. I could certainly see having increased political violence between rival political factions, although there seems to have actually been a decrease in that in the last few years, but it could make a comeback if the economy falls apart or something like that. So we'll see.
So there's a few things here. First of all, I don't think with hanging, I don't think hanging was included as a cruel and unusual punishment. I think hanging, along with firing squad, was considered humane because it was quick. Now, lynching, the problem with lynching is that it's outside of the domain of the political sphere because it's done by individuals. Now, you also mentioned, Keith, tarring and feathering, branding, and other things. I haven't looked at the data, but I would suspect that was more common before the Constitution. And then after the Constitution, I would imagine these trends, because of the Eighth Amendment, become less prevalent.
It was.
Okay. And then scientific punishments, like you mentioned, which were developed in order to be see, they were invented in order to be humane. And we might look back and say, well, that's horrible. How could you think that was humane? But the thing is, the very fact that we have that reflective mechanism as Americans, I think indicates that, see, technology is always difficult to project at the moment you invent it. You don't quite know what all the implications are going to be when you invent it. So you might think like that infamous video clip of George Bernard Shaw saying we need a humane gas to kill criminals. He was trying to be humane because he thought the gas would not do a lot of physical harm and you would just be dead.
It is compared to these older methods of execution. Yeah.
So I think in all of this, even though America, again, goes in spurts, and sometimes the excesses are actually private individuals and not the state, there is this built-in reflective mechanism to do this. So I'll give you an example, right? Let's look at lynchings, which is one of the most famous and infamous, if you will, uses of private justice. Depending on which sources you use, between 1865 and 1965, of all lynchings mentioned, of which 3/4 were black and the rest, and a quarter was white, anywhere from 6,000 to 8,000 people over a 100-year period. Let's put that into context. In the Haitian Revolution in the early 19th century, when the nationalist movement takes over, they kill 10,000 French in a year. And then afterwards is a massive civil war between the mulattoes and the, quote, pure-blooded blacks, who were the leading revolutionary agents. So Haiti just became this like bloodbath overnight, and it was fueled by black supremacists who not only didn't get along with the white French, but the mulatto caste as well. And so that was just the time was about a year, and it was 10,000, when at most in a century it was 10,000 lynchings. There's no comparison between Haiti and American lynchings. And furthermore, in many parts of the country, especially in the North, lynchings were seen as retrograde because it wasn't a part of an organized political system, and it disproportionately affected poor people. So I think what we see is that because the American culture, going back to the intention of the English settlers back in the 16th century, 17th century, I'm not saying there won't be violence in the country. I think there will be, and I think it'll probably peak early on in this process, and then it'll just kind of slow down, because part of it is we have this like built-in reflective mechanism as Americans. Americans are going to look at this and be like, well, that's horrible. Like, for example, if somebody tomorrow went, full Aztec and started eating people's hearts and mass human sacrifice, at the very least, everybody around them would just put them under interdict, and if not, lead an expeditionary force to wipe them out. Like, that's not going to be tolerated, right? Mass genocide of groups within the United States wouldn't be tolerated. So I think what would happen is, even if we did have spurts of violence in a sort of like collapse scenario, in addition to what I would consider the limits of violence, you need to have energy to commit acts of violence. And if you're in a system in which the energy is leaving the system, you're going to have a harder time engaging in sustained levels of violence. We saw this in 1946, right? After World War II, it's very hard to have the same level of sustained violence because everybody was destroyed. So in that way as well, too. But that's why I think we can be somewhat optimistic. And then Americans also are very innovative, right? I mean, especially in the modern age, technology is the way Americans express their innovation. But I think that it could also be expressed in cultural ways like music, literature, poetry, philosophy. It just hasn't yet, but I think it could. And so I think that you couple the American reticence to use unlimited violence and look back on history and say we failed to live up to our standards, and then at the same time American can-do attitude and creativity, I think we have reasons to be hopeful. Florian.
Yeah, what I find interesting is that if we discuss getting into a Mad Max world, the US is actually, if you look at it, is actually a civil version of Mad Max, if you want, right? If you take pioneers that went out west, there's just nothing but desert in some cases, or nothing but steppe. And that looks like a scenario of Mad Max too, but everyone is there's no chaos. There's a civil order to it, right? So ironically, one way that the American Revolution was different from the French Revolution is simply because there was more space. The difference was that it didn't devolve into a wanton violence as the French Revolution with Robespierre's terror regime that lasted for 2 years, from 1793 to 1794. That didn't happen in the US, probably, which is kind of surprising, because it's the same type of people. Should it matter whether they're in the US or in France? Maybe not, but France was a completely integrated country. There was nowhere you could leave. In the US, you could just strike, just go out west and just avoid trouble. If you're, people could just spread out. And so there was no violence for that reason. It didn't devolve into Mad Max like scenario. It didn't include like a reign of terror like in the French Revolution. So I find it interesting that the US has always been kind of like the Mad Max cityscape, especially during the time of the Manifest Destiny, but still with civil order. So whereas there was much more cruelty and argumentatively more of a Mad Max environment in Europe, but everything was like condensed in like city states or like dense populated countries. So I think geography plays a big role, whether something devolves into chaos or whether there's some social order. that's one idea I got from one historical perspective I got from Sovereign Citizen, which is the book I'm just reading. It's similar to Balahi's network state that Keith was pointing to. And basically, they said in the very beginning, if you look at Egypt, for example, you could keep people under control easily because they had, you couldn't survive if you were away from the Nile. It was just impossible. So that kept people in line because you could just punish people by expelling them from society. I'm sure they did, and then you would just simply die. And it's interesting how geography plays also a big role into how societies evolve or devolve. Also, very important, I think, what is cruel to us now doesn't necessarily seem cruel then. If the example is lobotomies, like if you treat mental patient with lobotomies, that would be a horrible punishment. But since just 100 years ago, people thought that's the enlightened thing to do. In fact, the inventor of the lobotomy even got a Nobel Prize for that. So back then, that was not to punish the mental patients, probably, although some mental wardens were probably also very cruel. But it may have been thought like to be beneficial for people, right? Also the legal theories back then were different, right? In the 19th century, criminals were seen as genetic freaks, right? And you can't really reform a genetic freak, right? So in that way, the cruel, unusual punishment prohibition is even more remarkable. So they say, okay, we know those can't be changed, but we'll try to do our best to keep them somehow integrated in society. And nowadays, over time, you have the concept of psychological, sociological causes of deviance, and then I think your approach to punishment also becomes different, and that also makes the actions against perpetrators in the colonies, the lenient actions, right, not unusual punishment, just shaming them, that becomes more significant. I think cameras will deter crime in a sense, but only if the crime in the end is punished, right? Like if you look at the store policies in California, you saw that mostly, but also in New York sometimes. You had mobs of people roaming stores, like big department stores, sometimes luxury stores, and the policy of the stores is, corporate policy is, you don't go after these people. So you had like an epidemic of these gangs that would just like descend on an Apple store, like grab everything and then go away, like 20 people doing a smash and grab. And they did that because nobody really was punishing them. And so that also encourages crime, right? And so I think, there will be more political violence in the US that is possible. But I think since the US still has the ability for people to avoid one another, which would be more in line with a pioneer spirit, look like a Mad Max world, but people can avoid each other, and then social order will be more stable. There will still be social order because you have small groups, small sovereignties of people, and they once again cannot devolve into wanton violence when punishing the transgressions.
All right, Keith.
Yeah, the point about how in 19th century criminology there was this idea that criminals were just simply born to be criminals was an interesting idea. There was a famous criminologist, Cesar Lombroso, who had this kind of idea. He thought that criminality was a biological condition, and it was widely believed that you could tell a person was a criminal by the length of their fingers. Like if somebody had long fingers, then they're more likely to be a thief, or the shape of their skull, or this was back when craniology and all that kind of stuff was in vogue. And then over time, the paradigm shifted to where there was a widespread belief that crime is purely social. Well, crime is caused by everything from bad parenting to poor education to poverty to something else. And that kind of thinking really started to peak in the mid 20th century, I guess. And it spurred a lot of criminal justice reform that many people thought was an overreach, and then that led to a pushback. Um, there was a landmark work in criminology done in the mid 70s by a criminologist named Samuel Yockelson. Well, he was more of a psychiatrist, but he specialized in criminal psychology. And this started moving the paradigm away from the idea that criminality is simply socially caused, that it focused more on individual personality structures. And from what I know of the field of criminology, the prevailing view today is that there are some people that are just simply antisocial. I mean, they're just simply seemingly born with antisocial personality disorder, which is the DSM-5 or whatever term for it. And at the same time, crime can also have social causes as well. I mean, you can be socialized to be a criminal, or you can be driven to crime by external circumstances, and then there's also issues like mental illness and all that kind of stuff as well. It's like what are all these different contributing factors to criminal behavior? But at the same time, there's also been a pushback now against the idea that of punitiveness. Like in the mid 20th century, there was a move towards the idea of criminal justice reform and more leniency in terms of handling criminals. We had a crime wave in the 70s and 80s, and people started saying, well, maybe that's a little too far in the other direction. So we started having the pushback, and then we started having the mandatory minimums and all, and that in turn led to things like mass incarceration, and then there's since been a pushback against that, as we know, through the Black Lives Matter and all these other things. So there's always a push-pull on this stuff. It seems like one paradigm will be in vogue for a while, and then there'll be a pushback, and another paradigm will come in. And I tend to be have mixed opinions on this kind of stuff. I mean, on one hand, there's the question of, well, what is crime in the first place? Formally, it's just simply something the state prohibits, which can mean anything. There's crime in the common sense, which is basically aggressive antisocial behavior, and I think people can be either socialized into that, or they can be born with a personality structure that leads to a propensity for that. I do think there's some evidence that some of that kind of stuff is genetic, or at least it doesn't have social causes, whatever the causes may be. And the as far as what society at large should do about it, obviously that's one of the most difficult social questions there is. Because virtually everybody agrees that there has to be controls on crime and violence and things like that in society, but how to do that is one of the most controversial issues, and that gets back to questions like should we have the death penalty? How strict should law enforcement should be? What kind of powers should police have? How do you balance that with the rights of the accused and all these other due process and all these other things? And I don't think that conflict's ever going to go away, because it involves having to weigh all kinds of contending interests against each other and trying to find some happy medium. There's this idea, well, if we get too lenient in penalizing criminals, we're going to have too much crime. If we get too strict, then we're going to have state, government overreach or violations of civil rights or civil liberties and that kind of stuff. So I think that's always going to be there. And interestingly, I've noticed that in some other countries, there's actually been moves toward criminal justice reforms that seem to work. Like the most, I don't know if the term progressive or whatever would be accurate, but the most progressive criminal justice system that I know of is probably in Norway. In Norway, they limit criminal penalties to, I think, a maximum of 20 years. And to get 20 years, you've really got to screw up, But now they do have the option of extending the period of incarceration by 5-year intervals if the person is still judged a danger to society. For instance, Anders Breivik, the terrorist, he's incarcerated in Norway, and he has a maximum 20-year sentence. And I imagine that when that 20 years is passed, he'll probably get another 5 added on, then another 5. He'll probably be deemed one of those too dangerous to ever let go. Um, but I know Europeans, not just Europeans, but people in other places as well, who look at American criminal justice, where you give somebody a 3 life sentences or something, and they're like, to them that just seems nonsensical. It's like, well, how do you? It's not so much even a question of leniency or non-leniency. It's just a matter of it's stupid. Like the guy who did the ran over the woman at the Charlottesville riot some years ago. He was sentenced to something like 419 years. And I mean, obviously the guy's not going to live for 419 years. So what's the point? And also, I've seen other criminal justice reforms in other countries where they try to make incarceration more reformative, where offenders actually learn job skills and they learn to take responsibility for things, and that seems to be one of the few things that actually works with antisocial personality. Like in the field of psychology, the one therapeutic model that seems to have any effect at all on people that have been diagnosed with ASPD, antisocial personality disorder, is cognitive behavioral therapy. And the way that that's used in clinically is you're simply motivating criminal types to recognize how their own patterns of thought and behavior are harming themselves. Because one of the characteristics of these types of people is they don't care about other people. So you push that to the side and say, okay, look, you keep doing this stuff, you keep going to jail, all these other things, bad things keep happening to you. Do you want to change that? Do you want to not go to jail? And you help them to adjust their patterns of thinking so that at bare minimum, out of for the sake of self-interest, they try to change their behavioral patterns. But that's a long way from branding somebody or burning them at the stake or something. It's interesting to consider, though, that in past times when they had all these really gruesome punishments, there was actually more crime. It doesn't really seem to have been much of a deterrent, because societies were typically much more violent back then. You could say, well, is that a product of modern affluence? That the wealthier, more aggregate wealth there is in a society, the less violence there is. Maybe, but who knows?
Yeah, as to that last point, I'd say at least in the 13 colonies, that doesn't seem to be the case, because obviously Old England was richer than the 13 colonies.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But the 13 colonies had, I think, probably less crime because of this attitude. As we near the end of the hour, I'll wrap up with this concept. I think what we've seen with the beginning of the English settlement in the New World up until 1776 was, for lack of a better word, the creation of a cultural machine that is dynamic and that has a dynamic self-correcting mechanism that allows the American people to look at what they stand for, in this case, prohibitions against cruel and unusual punishment, and then adjust their behavior over time to become closer to the ideals that they claim to hold, right? And so originally this was rooted in a conception of Anglo-Saxon common law and Old Testament Hebrew case law, which then fed into the Eighth Amendment, which said no cruel and unusual punishment. And part of this is the process of education and reasoning. Part of this is the process of conditioning. But I think what we've seen here is the creation of a cultural machine. And like you said, Keith, around the world, the death penalty is falling out of vogue. So it could just be also the spiritual machine is now going global, and that other people are like, oh, hey, this American way of doing things isn't so bad after all. So I don't know how it was built, but I think what we can say is a cultural or spiritual machine has been built that is dynamic and self-correcting, that realigns Americans closer to their stated values. That's what I'll end with. Florian.
Yeah, it's interesting because in this all crime and punishment landscape, other states have taken different approaches, right? I'm thinking about El Salvador, where Bukele basically threw gang leaders into prison, and then over time he reintegrates the minor members right? So, and that is in line with what other people have said. If you arrest the 5% hardened criminals and take them out of society, you get a society that's maybe not virtually free of crime, but you get like a drastic reduction in crime. Um, and sort of that's what civil governments have done since 1945, right? So basically rehabilitate people, and there's the worst offenders. They basically get life in prison or more. Even in Germany, you can get life, like 20 years, 15 to 20 years, and then afterwards you can be ordered into psychological, yeah, basically can order into a mental hospital where you stay for the rest of your life. So so but then the problem is that governments don't always are efficient enough to persecute, to follow up and persecute every criminal, and then people start doubting that the criminal system is effective to begin with, right? Also, we have a move towards leniency in the US always, but nowadays we still have problems like civil forfeiture, right? So if somebody, if the police arrests you and they find you with more than $10,000 on you, they keep that money, and good luck getting that money back. And it's called civil forfeiture. They take your assets, and yeah, I mean, in principle, you can go through the legal system to get it back, but good luck doing that. That takes forever, and you're probably not even getting it back because they always find a reason why not now is not a good point to give it back to you. Um, Also, and from a different angle, if you look at Norway, who incarcerates criminals for 20 years, um, you kind of also protect people in jail, right? So, 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 if someone like Anders Breivik is going to be released, uh, maybe I don't know how Norwegians tick, but maybe he won't survive a week and he's taken out, right? But people will maybe start wanting to lynch him, right? Because it was so gruesome what he did that people think there's no forgiveness. We just wait out until he's released from prison. So in a way, for the hardened criminals, prison is a way to save them from the wrath of society. And so you really do. That's the idea. You do hardened criminal a favor by locking them up, right? Um, and what I also found interesting, and when I did some research on the Eighth Amendment and what counted as cruel, unusual punishment, um, yeah, punishment is a ladder, right? So you start with like fines, and then you go higher and higher. So fines, then there's prison, and then there's also the way of expelling you from a country. But in a Supreme Court case in 1958, it was decided that revoking citizenship is cruel and unusual punishment. So basically, his case was called Tro against the United States. Trop versus Dulles. 1958. Trop was accused of treason during World War II, and his punishment was his citizenship gets revoked. And the SCOTUS decided that this is cruel, unusual punishment. Mind you, 1958, people thought, I mean, the Supreme Court would still rule that the death penalty is not cruel and unusual. I would say leaving the guy alive but throwing him out of the country is certainly more lenient than killing him, but maybe the mindset was different back then. It's an interesting ladder that revoking citizenship is seen as worse, and you gotta enjoy the benefits of American citizenship by getting executed, basically. Not in Trop's case, but that's basically the spirit between not revoking death penalty, but blocking people from taking your citizenship away.
Well, the other thing strange, I think the Constitution has a provision for executing treasonous individuals. So that's also interesting. Final thoughts, Keith.
Yeah, I don't know anything about the Supreme Court case from the 50s that's being discussed, but I think that case, from what I'm hearing, is relevant to current times because there's a move now against birthright citizenship, over the immigration controversy. And I would guess that in the 1950s, the Supreme Court would have had qualms about saying that citizenship revocation would be constitutional, particularly if the person in question was actually born in the United States or was a natural born citizen. I think that the efforts to revoke birthright citizenship, depending on how aggressively that's pursued, I think that's going to run into major constitutional problems because for the 14th Amendment, you can argue that the 14th Amendment really only applies to. There's some people who say, well, the 14th Amendment really only applied to released slaves that had been, after the Civil War that were born in the United States, just weren't previously considered citizens. But I think a modern court in the United States would most likely hold that no, anybody born in the United States is a citizen, and because that's certainly how that's the common understanding of the law, and it's largely how it's been applied for quite some time. And I think even Republican leaning judges and Supreme Court justices would see potential legal problems with the idea of revoking birthright citizenship. So maybe, but it's going to be interesting to see where this goes in the future. Initially we were talking about whether or not there's going to be more violence in society, presumably between non-state actors, and I think we could very well move into a period like that at some point in the future. Maybe not right away, but we could have our own version of the Troubles of the Years of Lead. There certainly have been analysts like Barbara Walter, for example, who's a former CIA analyst who studies conflict around the world. She's argued that we're starting to show more and more symptoms of politicized violence. Although, interestingly, there wasn't much in the way of in response to Trump's recent election, so maybe not. Maybe that kind of stuff is no longer in style. Like when disco replaced hippies, or when grunge rock replaced hair bands, or something like that. Maybe political violence is less in style than it was 5 years ago. But at the same time, when you have a polarized society and serious socioeconomic problems, there usually is a violence associated with that. And as far as the criminal violence, as I said, crime is fairly low now compared to what it was in the 70s and 80s. It could increase, particularly if the economy goes down the tubes. That might lead to renewed calls for law and order or whatever. Or there could be a more pushback. Like I know a lot of people from the left end of the spectrum are going to be aggravated with the illegal immigration crackdown we're seeing now, or which may happen throughout Trump's term, and that could lead to more, Black Lives Matter type pushback against law enforcement. So, who knows?
Well, again, thank you, Keith. Thank you, Florian. It's a pleasure having you on. It's Todd Lewis, the Praise the Fly podcast, signing off.